Leave no one behind is the central transformative promise of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. Translating this bold global commitment into an action-oriented mindset and result is a tall order. Is it possible to achieve a better future for all? It's hard to deliver this in practice, but it's also easy to be skeptical about inclusive development. For this episode, I'm pleased to welcome Elina Scheja, who is lead economist at the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, Jane Carter, who is senior advisor on natural resource governance at Helvetas, and Holly Krueger, who is managing partner at the Canopy lab. The Swedish Development Cooperation takes a multidimensional view of poverty. What does this imply, Elina? Could you tell us what the dimensions of poverty are?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Swedish International Development Cooperation has been working with multidimensional poverty for a long time. But since we got the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, the bar was raised higher. The agenda says that we should aim to eradicate poverty in all its forms everywhere, but it doesn't explicitly state what these dimensions are. So SIDA took this challenge at heart and made a inclusive exercise of talking to our partners and colleagues and what we mean by multidimensional poverty. And even though the experience of poverty is very personal and varies by context, we ended up defining 4 different dimensions of poverty, or broad categories of poverty, that would help us structure our thoughts. So the first category, that is the basis of our definition, is resources. So according to SIDA, a person who's living in poverty is resource poor, and poor also in other dimensions. And here we talk about your ability to provide for your family, ability to have a decent standard of living. So we're talking about your income, your assets, maybe you have a car to drive to work or a house to live in. But we also include immaterial assets like your skills in order to work, or your health. So that is a quite broad definition of resource base. But we also recognize that being poor is not, you're usually poor in resources, but that might not be where the problem lies. So why you don't have the income is possibly because of the other dimensions. So the second dimension that we focus on is opportunities and choice. That talks about your ability to build your resource base and use your resources proactively. So if you have skills, you need access to productive jobs. You need access to the labor market. You also need access to basic infrastructure such as electricity and internet. You need access to healthcare if you get sick, and also a possibility to educate you further. So this is pretty much about the capability approach of becoming the best version of yourself, allowing people to grow. But just having the opportunity in theory might not work either, which brings us to the third dimension, which is power and voice. At the core, this is about your opportunity to influence your decisions that are important for your life. So it could be at home, the decision making between the spouses, who decides about the resources. It could be being able to participate in the decision making in your community or at the local election. It's quite a lot about discrimination. So your ability to get a job might be restricted if you belong to a Roma population and you're discriminated against on undue grounds, or females might be discriminated. So we're looking at people's ability to exercise their choices in a decent way. The fourth and final category that we think is important to understand why people are being left behind is human security. And here we talk about physical, sexual, and psychological violence, or threat of such violence that people are experiencing and that is holding them back. So for instance, if women are afraid to take the bus late in the evening, or if the parents are not willing to send their kids to school that are further away, they are limiting their choices and ability to build their resources. So our definition is being resource poor and poor in one or several of the other dimensions. And we think that the interplay between these dimensions is really the key to understand why people are still being left behind. We still, in this day and age, have almost 10% of the world's population in absolute poverty, and we have a lot of segments of the population that are being left behind. It's not a random sample of the population. We need to understand what part of their life, what is the phase of the poverty, and how does these different dimensions interlink to keep people in poverty in order to find pathways out of poverty.
How can multidimensional poverty analysis be integrated into the various operational decisions related to design and implementation of regional programs like RECONOMY?
Yeah, so far I've been talking about the framework of, or the mindset of how this could be analyzed. Putting this in a more operational context is the next step. And I think this, bearing in mind the different dimensions of poverty and allowing yourself to systematically look at the different dimensions will help you also to focus your programs. We found it very helpful to bring people from different thematic areas together, people living in different countries, working on different industries, and finding the common language. We're talking about people who have been left behind. And we focus our discussions on 3 questions. We want to understand who is being left behind, how does poverty look like for them, or what deprivations do they have, and what are the underlying causes of them. So having this multidimensional mindset keeps you focused and keep your eye on the ball. Who are we trying to influence, and what is keeping them behind? If I could give you one concrete example of how this has been used, our partners in Bolivia were designing a market systems development project, and their aim was to promote productive employment, especially for women's economic empowerment. And they were looking at ways to create jobs and increasing employability. But once they did their ground analysis, looking at the different dimensions, they realized that actually what is holding these women down is gender-based violence at home that has been very widely spread. And no matter how many jobs they would create, that would still be a constraint. So they actually ended up adding a new component that they weren't anticipating on gender-based violence. And I just checked the latest evaluation of that program, and that was the component that was deemed to be the most effective part of it. So allowing you to see the people your target group, analyzing what situation they are living in, irrespective of which industry you're working on, and then finding out what the binding constraint is the way of applying this in the program level. You don't have to do everything in every dimension, but understanding the complexity and teasing out the binding constraints wherever they may lie will help your discussions and also keep you focused.
Since the introduction of SIDA's multidimensional view of poverty, what have been the key lessons in terms of good practices and challenges?
We have applied this thinking and framework for some years now. And I think what this has provided us is a common language. So it's now easier to talk about these things across countries and networks. We also take this dialogue with our partners and have also deepened our understanding on the focus questions. And I think we have become much better at formulating our theory of change. How are we? What are the key problems, and how are our interventions affecting the target population, to be more explicit about it, has also strengthened our analysis and understanding, which has come very handy now that COVID-19 hit, because that has changed the circumstances in a lot of the countries where we are active. But those country offices that had done their multidimensional poverty analysis were also better able to adapt their programs, because they understood how different things are connected, and could easily identify different groups and understand their problems. So there have been a lot of advantages, but there are also undeniably also challenges. When you have a broad definition, it might be more difficult for you to prioritize between the different dimensions, and also it requires more work because it poses the big questions, and you need to keep updated on your analysis. But I guess we have come quite far in our journey, and I think that is in the essence of analyzing complex issues, that you do need to go back and redo it as you go along, and you learn new things as we go along. So it's still work in progress, but so far so good.
Following from Elina's comments, I wanted to talk to you, Jane, about inclusive development. Are inclusive development and achieving economic growth mutually exclusive goals? Do you consider inclusiveness and growth as two different aspects of development?
Actually, before I answer that one, maybe I can just comment a little bit about what Elina has just said, because I think what CEDA's come up with is a very interesting definition of multidimensional poverty. But it also builds, of course, on other work that's been done. I'm thinking particularly about the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, and the OEC definitions. But it's this emphasis on greater voice and security, which I think is important. And I've often been struck, in fact, by those sort of aspects when meeting with the people with whom we work. I think it's very important to take into account the sort of social, psychosocial aspects of poverty, and the importance actually of human dignity, of treating people as individuals. And if I give you an example of that, I remember in Madagascar, we did a study on what people consider well-being. How do you define to be well? And one of the things they said, which was very important to them, was to be able to participate in the annual celebration of ancestors. They have a reburial rite where they go back and they talk to the ancestors, and they invite a lot of people. And of course, that's expensive. So if you're not able to do that, then you really feel yourself to be outside the community, and to not have respect. So that was one thing that they really highlighted. And then more recently in my work in Nepal, I think you know I was based for the last 3.5 years in Nepal, and they're working with the people after the earthquake. Again, it was this sense of dignity, or restoring people's dignity, and their voice, which was very important. And I think you've got some pictures there actually of the people that we worked with. So you've got there Lok Bada Tamang. He was somebody who not only lost his house, but he also got into really horrible debt because he had a heart complaint. And so he had quite a lot of medical treatment with that, as a result of which, yeah, as I say, he was in really bad debt. And in Nepal, the interest rates are so high that once you get into debt, it's very difficult to get out of it. I mean, we couldn't do anything about that itself, although what we did was we trained him as a village water maintenance person. So at least he had a little bit of income from that, but he also had status in the village from that. And that was just really important to him, the fact that project people were coming and going and always seeking him out and talking to him. It gave him a sense of worth and purpose. So I think you also got there the picture of Dana Maya Magatapa. So she's a little bit of an older lady, maybe not that old. I don't think she's much older than me actually, but in village Nepal, you age quite quickly, yeah. And again, she'd lost her house, and just the effort of trying to rebuild, to organize laborers, to organize all the paperwork, etc., was too much for her. So to have people who came and talked to her and treated her with respect and dignity was really important. And as I say, I think those aspects were just as important as the actual sort of material help that was given. So yeah, you asked anyway about whether inclusiveness and economic growth are two different aspects of development. And there I think you can't separate them. But what I'd actually like to question is whether economic growth as we know it today is the only solution, as it were. And I think the COVID pandemic actually has really highlighted that there are problems with this. Because if you look at what's happened there, it's often people who had more resources and assets, people who are basically richer, who have got richer as a result of the pandemic, and people who are poorer, who've really particularly had difficulty. Yeah, and there is also a gender aspect with that. I mean, I don't want to generalize too much, because I know that it's men who've often died more in the pandemic, but still, it's often businessmen, men who've made money during the pandemic, whilst those in a much more precarious position, women in precarious employment, who have to stay at home, look after the children, these classic things, they have particularly suffered also from gender-based violence. So there's something inherently wrong, isn't there, in a system which basically favors those who already have something. But yeah, to go on a little bit more from that, I think you know that my background is in natural sciences. So actually my first degree is in agriculture and forest sciences. And I think here there's the important thing that we have to look more at what we're doing to the natural world, what we're doing to natural resources with this idea of unfettered economic growth. And that's being recognized increasingly if you look at the literature which is coming out these days on the way that we're destroying biodiversity. It's really something that we have to look at. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Dasgupta report that came out in England quite recently, or then here in Switzerland, Swiss Re, the big reinsurers, brought out a report last year about biodiversity.
I'm aware that the Dasgupta report looks at the economics of biodiversity, and that Swiss Re has come up with what they call a Biodiversity and Ecosystems Services Index, or BES index, by country.
That's right. So in both cases, we've got an economic assessment of the damage being done to natural resources. And the argument is that we clearly can't keep on going as we are. Dasgupta mentions a study which shows that at our current rate of consumption, we need 1.6 Earths to keep going as we are. And he also points out very clearly that it's the poorest people in the poorest countries who are suffering the most.
So we need to stop thinking about reducing poverty through economic growth.
I think that's basically the message, yes. And actually, perversely, it's often the poorest people who know that the best, or who are very much aware of it, because they're the ones who are most closely associated with those natural resources and who use them for their livelihoods. So I think we need to get away from the economic model that doesn't value the biodiversity, the natural resources as a good, and incorporates that into the economic model. Go on. So there needs to be a system whereby polluter pays, the users of natural resources actually pay for them. And I think this is the way forward. We need to have a system whereby the rights of people who are most close to resources, the natural resources, are recognized, and that somehow we have a system whereby we try to find ways of reducing poverty, whereby they are paid for the conservation of biodiversity, for the resources on which they've traditionally depended for their livelihoods. And although that might sound fanciful, there certainly are a lot of models these days for payment for environmental services, PES. So as I say, that's the way I think we need to go forward, really looking at how we can generate opportunities for poverty reduction through the conservation of biodiversity, and that way giving greater opportunities and voice and security to the world's poorest women and men.
Programs like RECONOMY or other projects have been applying the inclusive systems approach, also known as market systems development approach. What does it take for such programs that use the approach to leave no one behind, Holly?
That's a really excellent question. Well, I believe the potential for market systems approaches to be inclusive has always been there. In my opinion, the implementation of inclusive market systems development approaches is something that is only more recently gaining traction. And it's exciting to see that that's a core aspect of the RECONOMY program. One of the main reasons why I believe programs have been slow to employ more inclusive practices is that the way that program and staff really talk about who the end beneficiary are. They think about a farmer, they think about an entrepreneur, an employer or a worker, but they don't really start to understand, there's female farmers, there's young female farmers, there's older male farmers. There's really a lot of, these groups are not homogenous. And in order for programs to be inclusive, they really need to understand who are these people, who's actually part of the market system, and what are the opportunities and constraints that each face, and how can programs start to be more responsive to that. So I think for programs to really ensure that they're inclusive or that they leave no one behind, programs really need to think about 4 things. I'm going to touch on these, and I'm also going to bring in some of my experience as an advisor to market systems development programs in Congo and in Indonesia. So the first thing I think programs need to do is really, as I said, understand who is in the market system. And sometimes you can think about this in terms of market segmentation. Who's there? How do they show up? What are their roles and responsibilities? So for example, in a program in the Congo, they're working in the coffee and cocoa sectors. And when they started to really understand this, when they started to research who's there, they realized that women were actually primarily responsible for a lot of the key production and quality related tasks. But previously, when they thought about coffee farming, they'd only thought about farmers, or often just male farmers. And so they were really, their extension activities had been overlooking a really important group of people who needed to understand how to better apply agricultural techniques. So that's the first thing, to really understand who's in the market system. The second thing is really understanding the opportunities and constraints facing each of these different groups from accessing the improved market system. In often cases, this is really around understanding the social norms that shape their access to more inclusive systems. If I go back to that coffee example in the Congo, the norms is that you invite the head of the household, which is often a male farmer. And so male farmers had historically been accessing a lot of training provided by coffee exporting companies. But when we started to understand and talk to these companies and say, you only have 30% participation of women in your coffee training programs, you're really missing out on an important demographic. You need to actually you need to purposefully invite women to attend your training. And you also need to change some of the training locations so that women have more access to them. We know that there's women have higher mobility issues, and particularly in light of COVID-19, we wanted to help these companies really understand how could they boost female participation in their training so that the right content is actually reaching the right person. So again, the second point is really around understanding the opportunities and constraints facing each of these groups. The third piece I would recommend is on the design of the intervention itself. That intervention needs to respond to these opportunities and constraints of these different groups. It also needs to take into consideration the historic inequalities facing many of these groups. Women and other socially excluded groups may need more direct assistance than traditional market system development programs have been providing. In some cases, this might be doing supplementary confidence building training for an access to finance program. And more may be other things, such as addressing helping companies develop a gender equality and social inclusion policy. The fourth piece I think is important around for programs to really implement inclusive market systems development programs is on the monitoring and learning side. We don't know how to do this well. What we do know how to do is to test things, to learn what's working, because each context is so highly specific. So something that works in Eastern Europe may not work in Central Africa. And so we need to draw from some of these basic concepts and start to test and iterate and learn and continue to evolve along the way. So I think, in summary, there's really 4 pieces I would highlight for programs if they want to be more inclusive and if they want to ensure that no one is left behind, that they understand who's in the system, understand opportunities and constraints, really design for those constraints and opportunities as well, and think about supplementary programming, and then see what happens and make changes along the way.
What are the strategies that you are using in the projects you've been working with to ensure that benefits for the target group are inclusive?
You know, we talked about design in the earlier question. Here, for me, this is really around monitoring and learning. So in the Indonesian program I'm involved with, we track 6 indicators related to women's economic empowerment, and we follow up with qualitative research, because often we find that quantitative data collection, particularly as it relates to issues facing women or women's economic empowerment or better understanding excluded groups, so oftentimes quantitative information doesn't provide enough insight. So when you start to see kind of something funny with the quantitative information, we want to follow that up with qualitative research to deepen our understanding. You know, an example of this would be often we look at the burden, whether workloads are increasing for women in a given program, recognizing that in some cases an increasing in workload is considered as a negative effect of an intervention, but depending on how that increase in workload is perceived by women, that may actually not be as negative as is perceived kind of in the quantitative data. So really following up with that qualitative information. You know, in the Congo program, we use a slightly different framework to understand kind of the impact of the work that goes beyond just, you know, are men and women, are people with disabilities accessing the improved market systems, but what is the quality of that access? How is that access actually improving opportunities for leadership, opportunities for advancement in given roles? So we really try to bring in both programs, but in different ways, an understanding of to contextualize basically the types of benefits that people are using, or people are benefiting from. The other piece I want to just highlight, and we haven't talked about it in the earlier question, is that I think to really ensure the strategies that are needed by a program to ensure that benefits are inclusive, it really starts with the program staff. And for me, because really market systems development, inclusive market systems development is around influencing businesses and market actors to change their behaviors in favor of poor and excluded groups. If your staff don't believe in the importance of it, if your staff don't think that women are a viable market segment, if they don't believe people with disabilities represent a real viable market opportunity for businesses, they're not going to be able to sell it to their partners. So I always really want to emphasize the importance of, you need to win over the hearts and minds of your staff in order to ensure that businesses are being advised in a way that really helps them seize these opportunities and follow through on it.
All right, thank you for watching another round of Inclusive Plug powered by RECONOMY. Please let us know in the comment section whether you agree or disagree with the ideas expressed by our guests. We have interesting topics coming up, so stay tuned and hit the subscribe button. This was Sabine, a communication manager at RECONOMY, a program of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency implemented by Helvetas in 12 countries in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Thank you for tuning in, and see you soon.